Hi, Tim Horschler back with part 2 of our discussion on rigid heddle weaving and the Kromski Harp. This section we're going to talk about the parts of looms and how a rigid heddle loom is different than a harness type of loom, just for your own information and get a good understanding of what you'll be having when you have a rigid heddle loom in your household. A rigid heddle loom is basically a frame loom. It's got 4 sides. Unlike a frame loom, the rear and front beam here rotate, so you can put a warp on a rigid heddle loom that is as wide as the weaving area here in front is for the particular rigid heddle loom you have, but the warp is meant to be carried forward from the back beam to the front beam. So in terms of length, you can weave 2, 3, 4 yards or more of material from one warp being put on the rigid heddle loom. A rigid heddle loom uses a rigid heddle to manipulate your warp ends here to create the shed that you use to pass your stick shuttle through here. A rigid heddle loom is made up of a frame with molded plastic in here generally, and these plastic parts are alternating slots and holes. Let me give you a close-up of that. You can see these holes and slots along here, and this is where the warp material comes through. The difference between a rigid heddle and a table or floor loom that has harnesses that go up and down is that this rigid heddle does 2 jobs for you on a rigid heddle loom. It creates your sheds, the opening. It has an up and a down position only, and you use it as a beater to compress your weaving. And so it'd be coming forward like this, and you're going to be beating here. Whereas on a table or floor loom with harnesses, the harnesses are separate from the beating piece of equipment, which is called a reed. And the harnesses go up generally, or up and down depending on the style of the loom, and you use that just to create the shed, whereas the reed on a harness type loom is used just to create your beating. So on a rigid heddle loom, we've combined those parts into one piece here. It does limit you in terms of what you can do on a rigid heddle loom. It doesn't have the various settings in terms of the harnesses that allow for the type of patterning or effect that you want, the complexity of the weaving that you want in a project. A rigid heddle loom with 1 heddle on it is the same as a harness loom with 2 harnesses. Pretty limiting in terms of what you can do, but with a rigid heddle loom you compensate for that by using color and texture and combinations of the 2 on the warp and on the weft here to make your project. A rigid heddle loom is not as fast in terms of its operation as a harness loom, so you're going to give up a little bit of efficiency. But on the other hand, there are many aspects of rigid heddle weaving that you can't accomplish really on a floor or table loom, and so you're trading one benefit for another. You're trading speed and complexity of weaving for something that is a little bit more portable, straightforward, perhaps easier to learn on, and but still being able to produce very interesting weaving projects on it that I think you'll find enjoyable. With a rigid heddle, as with a harness type of loom, the material that you use for your warp has to come through the rigid heddle, and you have to be aware that it has to come through and be manipulated up and down and forward and backwards so that the yarn passes through the heddle without being obstructed in any way. So you can't put something that's really thick through a rigid heddle loom without adjusting for the size of the heddle, what we call the dent size of the heddle that you have. Kromski harps come with a 10 dent heddle. 10 dent or dent measurements is a term in weaving we use to describe the number of ends, number of pieces of warp coming from the back to the front for every inch of length across the length of your heddle here. And so as you get a 12-dent Heddle, there's more slots and holes. An 8-dent Heddle would be less. And as you go up in the dent number, your yarn has to get a bit thinner, particularly on the warp. The weft material can always be whatever thickness you want. And as the number goes down, you'll be able to use a little bit of, excuse me, a little bit more thicker yarn. You still have those constraints on a harness type loom. It's not so much in the heddle on a harness loom, but at the reed where you have to be aware of those things. So keep that in mind. Any type of weaving, you have to be aware of the material that's coming through the loom in terms of its characteristics and how it's going to interplay with the parts that you have on your particular loom. So the Kromskis come with a 10, and you can purchase an optional 8 or 12 dent. Also, on the Kromski Harp, you have the option of adding a second heddle. This is a single rigid heddle loom, 2 positions up and down. But if you get an extra set of heddle blocks, these are the things that hold the heddle over here. You can manipulate 2 heddles at the same time. You can mimic a 4-harness loom setup. You can, with that, do more in terms of patterning with what you have on the loom. It's a little bit more complex in terms of its operation, and it's not as efficient as a harness loom in terms of those manipulations that you'll have to go through. And there's so many ways you can do other things on a rigid heddle loom that certainly out of the box you probably don't want to try two heddles at the same time. But 6 months, 12 months down the road, you may come to that conclusion that, hey, I want that challenge. I want to see what I can do with the 2 heddles over here. One of the ways that you can create some patterning and texturing effect with your weaving on a rigid heddle loom is the use of a pickup stick. And you get one of these with each Kromski Harp. It's a stick that has a beveled end on over here, and behind the heddle you would lace it in and out of the warp, and you would do this in a systematic way back here, over 3, under 3, over 3, under 3, something of that nature. And you use that behind it and you turn it up on end as you need it. And you can create very, very nice patterning effect. If you want to get a look at some of that, you can go to the New Voyager website under Weaving Accessories and Pickup Sticks, and you can see the types of effect that you can impart into your weaving with that. So that's the rigid heddle loom and how it's different from a harness loom. You're still going to produce very nice weaving projects. It's ideal for certain things and perhaps better than a harness loom for some. And in the next section, we'll go over the various specific parts of the rigid heddle loom, the stand and so forth, so you can get familiar with those terms and what they are and what they do.